So I had a few questions asking about Travis picking and how that relates to Mississippi John Hurt style and how you can move from playing Travis picking to playing Mississippi John Hurt style. I wanted to talk a little bit about that and show you some ideas about that today. So just to start off, Travis picking, the name Travis picking comes, of course, from the great guitar player Merle Travis, who played in a finger style, actually very similar to John Hurt's style. But his was a pretty sophisticated guitar playing style, and his name ended up getting us used for this Travis picking. But Travis picking usually refers to a simpler style that I would maybe refer to as pattern picking. So you learn a pattern, say thumb, index, thumb, middle, and you can play it over. You can play your different chords with that pattern. And then you have a nice accompaniment for a song. It's a really great style. And then you can get more sophisticated with different kind of patterns and but I want to make a distinction between pattern picking and what I call the Mississippi John Hurt style, or what it's a number of players played in that style. I like to think of it as a alternating thumb style. So the key is that the thumb is playing on alternate notes, usually on quarter notes. The other thing is, the other way it's referred to sometimes is an independent thumb, because the thumb is doing its own thing and your fingers are doing their own thing. And the Kentucky tradition that Merle Travis comes out of is just called thumb style guitar, which I think is appropriate because the thumb is the kind of leader here. So a good way to think about this, I think, to help compare it to a pattern picking style, is to understand that this alternating thumb style is influenced by guitar players wanting to sound like, say, a piano. So the thumb would be the equivalent of a piano player's left hand, so kind of keeping the rhythm, and maybe a stride piano or ragtime piano sort of keeping the rhythm on the left hand, and then the right hand maybe improvising or maybe playing pre-composed melodies in the right hand. But the two things are really happening separately. They're all happening in sort of a common rhythmic grid, but they're happening independently of one another. Another type of music that I think probably had an influence on this would be old-time string band music. And I know that John Hurt came from an area of Mississippi where the fiddle tune tradition was very strong. In fact, he was friends with a very famous duo, Narmore and Smith, who it was a fiddle guitar duo. The fiddle player, Willie Narmore, played his famous fiddle tunes, and his guitarist Shel Smith played the backup, and it was two instruments, and Smith's style on guitar was extremely simple. It was not much more than this. Hardly even a bass run, maybe occasionally something like that. Very simple. And it's interesting to listen to it and just compare it to John Hurt's thumb. It's actually very similar to what John Hurt's thumb is doing. And although John Hurt didn't play fiddle tunes, he did play tunes and songs that had melodies to them, and he would play the melody with his fingers. So I think it's important to think of this alternate thumb style as kind of running on two different tracks. There's two different voices, as it were, the thumb and the fingers. In pattern picking, so often it's all interrelated. The thumb, index, thumb, middle. There's really not a sense of independence there. And I think it's especially important in the player's mind if you develop, and in your muscle memory, develop an independence between your thumb and fingers. The listener will hear it as two different like sort of tracks, a rhythm track and then a melody track, or a bass track and a treble track, or however you want to think about it. And of course, there are times in which you're doing alternating thumb style, and it sounds a lot like pattern picking. But I think it's important to make that distinction, that that to get to that point of having that sort of independence, you really need to think of them separately, and then they'll come together as you play. So let me just illustrate a few things here. I made a little loop on my looper pedal. It's just the thumb. It's just the thumb part of a song, and I'm just gonna play this loop for you here. That's all there is to it. It's actually a fine accompaniment. A fiddle player could play on top of this, or whatever. Or you could. So I just wanted to illustrate there that in that case, I'm just playing the melody here with my fingers, and I'm just thinking about the melody and keeping it rhythmically correct, but the kind of accompaniment of the thumb that's coming from the looper is a separate thing. And it's so that's the idea. That's what we want to get towards, and that's why it's a challenge, I think. I think it is one of those things that after you work on it, when it starts to click, it really starts to click. But it's hard to get to that point. I totally understand that, and it's worth just sticking with it until you can create that independence. But when you do, you've got one part of your brain, one part of your musical brain that's just hearing this. Okay, and then that's sort of on autopilot. That's just going, and you almost don't have to think about it anymore. It's just kind of stored away in the subconscious. And that's what I say in some of the other tutorials where I talk about playing on the beat and off the beat. When you've got independence, when the thumb is independent from the fingers, you now have that option of playing on the beat or off the beat or mixing it up. And that was the point of those licks that I shared in the last video, where you kind of get these ideas in your mind. You kind of it sort of becomes second nature, and so that you can start thinking about just throwing in a little syncopation here. You don't have to kind of worry about the thumb. The thumb's off doing its own thing. It's completely independent. It is helpful at the beginning while you're doing this. Sometimes I think to think about when it's a pinch, in other words, on the beat, and when it's not a pinch, off the beat. So it could be that moving from pattern picking to more of a independent thumb, you will maybe. It almost is an idea of an independent number of patterns, but I would advise you just sort of realizing that you need to break out of that paradigm of patterns and start thinking about these as two separate tracks of music. And I do think there's a rut that you can get into if you don't sort of break it down, in that you need to think of everything as a pattern, and then it can be kind of hard to get into that independent place. So what I would advise you doing in that case is, instead of starting with pattern picking and do something more sophisticated, just break it down to just the thumb. Just keep the thumb there, and maybe whistle or hum the other part. Bum ba dum bum, bum ba dum bum, ba ba dum bum, ba ba dum bum, or even sing it. My Creole belle, I love you well, my darling baby, my Creole belle. And then you can hear the role that the thumb plays. that's helpful.